Welcome back to our second part of our three-part series, Work with What You Got. Today we're going to be focusing on making a sash belt or a waist tie for your dress. I'm Jesse Beardslee, designer and creator at Themis and Thread, coming to you from the shared studio space at Hector Handmade on Seneca Lake for tonight's So Wednesday Work with What You Got class from the Southeast Bend County Library. Glad you guys are back with me. Whether you're gonna add a waist tie with some embellishments to your dress or create a separate sash belt, tonight's class is going to be a pretty fun and easy one. The premise of a sash belt is just that it ties. So just like a waistband or a waist tie, it just kind of cinches you wherever you want to be cinched. So if it's going to be on your dress, think about what part of the bodice or the waist you'd like to have tightened and where you'd like to have the tie. It doesn't have to be in the back, it could be on the side, but generally what I like to do is just have it affixed directly to the piece for most of the front part of the garment. And if you are just doing a separate piece, it doesn't matter, you're not going to attach it anyways. So I'm going to use a necktie tonight, and I'll show you again how to disassemble the tie and also set aside some other scrap fabric, buttons, ribbon, and anything else that you might be interested in, like some lace or some trim, to create some embellishments for your belt. This colorful necktie has some stains and some rips on it, and I think that the pink will complement the pink in the skirt, although they're very different prints. That's definitely just a personal preference, and I understand if you are looking at a more traditional color scheme, but I'm going to just kind of go for it and go wild. So on the inside of the necktie, there's going to be some places that you're just going to want to trim off. Usually, see, sometimes you can even just pull it right off. This kind of stuff is usually just tacked on, and then we're going to want to get inside and pull all of this apart. You can use your snippers or your seam ripper, whatever feels like the easiest. And we're dissecting a necktie, pulling out the center, and we're going to get everything disassembled and then press it flat. That way you can see how much material you have to work with. This isn't a very typical necktie fabric. You do want to test the fabric before you press the whole thing, and make sure that you have the iron on the right setting so that you don't burn through it or melt it. There's going to be some loose threads to clean up, and then you have it, once you have it all pressed, you can see how much fabric there is to work with. And it really, the ties really do open up to quite a bit of fabric. You can, of course, just use the necktie as it is if you like the shape of it, and if it is long enough to tie all the way around your body. With your waist tie or belt, you're going to want to determine how wide you want it before you start cutting into your necktie or whatever the fabric that you're going to use for it is. A ribbon also works really nice as a waist tie. This one was pretty narrow that I made for my first dress, and for my second dress I'm actually going to cover, I think, quite a bit more. I think that I want to cover all of this old elastic band on my bodice, so I'm going to measure that and make sure that I have enough fabric. You can just put it on and look at yourself in front of the mirror and measure across, or you can just lay it flat in front of you. But what I'm going to figure out is how wide I'm going to want my waist tie and how much space I'm going to want to use to embellish. You don't have to embellish at all, it's just kind of a fun way to use up a little bit more of these scraps. So I think that for mine, I'm going to want it to be about that big, so I'll measure it exactly, and you should also on the piece, but I'm thinking I'm going to want mine to be at least 2.5 inches wide, and I think that this waist tie I want to have affixed for probably like 8 inches all the way across underneath my bust. These are all personal preferences, and you don't really know until you start trying things on. So lay out some colors and some patterns and some fabrics, take some notes, take some measurements, and then take a look at what you have for your material and work with what you got. I've decided that I definitely want my waist tie to be about 2.5 inches wide and 8 inches long where it'll be fastened down. I'm going to show you how to do this finished as if it were just by itself, but I'm personally going to tack mine on to my dress. So that way you can see a couple of different ways it can be done. So if I want this part of my waist tie to be 8 inches long, I'm going to actually cut it 8.5 inches long, giving myself a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side. What I'm going to do with that is attach a longer tie that's going to go all the way behind me and be able to tie to cinch my dress. Make sure that you provide enough fabric to go all the way around you and also be tied. Since I'm going to show this completely finished, 2.5 inches wide really is going to need to be 5.5 inches. So if you have an L square, that is a wonderful tool to use for this. And if not, you can make a separate pattern. You can mark it with a pen, or you could slip in some pins around. The L square is just going to give you a really nice even shape. So what I'm going to do here is mark off 8.5 by 5.5. And I'm just using a pen directly onto the fabric. I'm also going to slip in a 2.5 by 8 inches piece of this stabilizer, and I'm going to sew that right into the middle of my belt just to give it a little bit more stability, just like it was used for the tie. Now this is a really, really wide weave fabric, and it's definitely something that's going to fray if you end up using it for anything else. Just know that it will need to be stitched along the edge. So that's cutting it really close right there for the 2.5, but I got it. Again, this is going to go inside. So I have my 2 pieces cut out, and I've decided what side I want to be the front of my waistband. And with the front side up, I'm going to fold it and pin it. And then I'm going to just stitch a 1/4 inch right along this. And I'm just gently going to flip this inside out. Here's the seam. Just going to open it up and turn it inside out. You can use your tweezers if you need to, but this is a nice big piece. I think that we can get in there with ease. And with the seam positioned in the center, this will be the back side of the front of the waist tie. I'm just going to press it out. And then feed this stabilizer right in through it. Again, your tweezers might come in handy for this. Kind of reaching my tweezers up in to help pull this down. Position it neatly tucked in. Maybe give it another press. We still have these raw edges, and this is where we will attach the rest of the waist tie. Like I said, a piece of ribbon would be nice. I'm going to use another piece of the necktie. I put some pins in to hold down that stabilizer with the center of my waist tie. And I've made my ribbon from my necktie. Like I said, you can use just a ribbon. This necktie I have raw edges on, and it's going to stay. It's a really tight weave, and I think it's actually going to fray and look kind of cool. So I'm going to leave that like that. But you want to like just make sure that that's the case and pull on it a little bit if you feel like you like that look. If you don't, maybe just hem it over, roll it over and press it even a couple of times and give yourself a line of stitching. I'm going to take the good side and center it. And the good side on the other side and center it. I'm going to stitch this down, but I'm only going to stitch it to the top of the fabric. I'm not going to stitch it all the way through. I'm going to stitch it to the top of the fabric, and then I'm going to tuck all of this in and stitch it clean. Again, I'm only stitching the top two pieces. I'm going to leave the bottom and the stabilizer alone. So I'll kind of tuck that under. So I just have these top two pieces, and I'm going to stitch them exactly where they're pinned on both sides. Also be careful not to start your stitching or finish your stitching past the tie. So that's the dark blue part for me. You see the stitching is only on the dark blue, and again, only on the top two pieces. Removing all the pins, getting everything flattened out, and just tucking this in and following everything else. So just tuck in along that line of stitching. So it's just kind of like sandwiched in there. Press that flat. Do it on this other side. Fold it in and fold everything else in with it. Move it around with your fingers a little bit. Make sure that it's all nice and even before you press. If there's something that you don't like about it, just wiggle it out. It's okay if you have to try a couple of times. And then we're going to take this to the machine and stitch this down. For the edge of the waist tie, I'm going to follow along the outside of my presser foot as a guide. And I'm going to use a long stitch, so it'll be a nice top stitch. That keeps it nice and close to catch all those layers of fabric. And here it is, the base for our waist tie. I have it about 60 inches all the way around for me, and I'm going to use this base to do a little bit of embellishing. You can even leave it just like that and you have a tie. This could be the whole thing. You didn't have to do two different colors or two different neckties. I really hope that you guys are going to post what you've done so that I can see what you've come up with. If you want to make some flower embellishments, trim down some even rectangular strips a couple of inches wide and about 8 to 9 inches long. That'll be a little bit smaller than the last flower that we made in the last video. A couple of different layers of different lengths will make it more interesting looking, and if they will fray, do add a line of stitching along the top of the pieces. Once they're pinned together, get your hand needle out to do a wide basting stitch, and do leave one end of it knotted so that you can just slowly push the fabric down the thread and you will have the beginning of a flower. You just pull it all together and stitch that end together like we did in the first video, and you have a couple of flowers. I was getting ready to start embellishing my sash belt, and I held it up to me, and I really didn't like the shape going from the big triangle to the smaller tie where it lied on my bodice. So I took my seam ripper and I popped out these seams, these stitches, and I have to clean them up a little bit, but I wanted to just show you that sometimes the first try doesn't work and you don't like it for whatever reason. So what I think I will like better is more of like a gradual slope into the waist tie. So I'm gonna kind of press it down like that around all four corners, and then I'm gonna top stitch all the way around, and then I'll start embellishing. And just like I did here, I really like to pull these flowers together with the button in the center, and you can just tack that on with a needle and thread. You're gonna sew it by hand. You can sew the flower on first. If you want to attach the flower to a couple spots so they're not flopping around, that's a good idea. I'll use the same color thread, a dark blue thread, to tack it onto the strap here so that the flower will stay nice and tight. And again, I'll tack it down here. Really just with like a couple of stitches, just like you're doing a button. A couple of stitches and then knot it in the back. And I'll show you how to do that on a waist tie or a sash belt so that you don't have it ugly in the back. Here is my revised waist tie, and I think that it looks a lot better with these shapes than it did with the big corners hanging off. And here's the back. Like I said, I'm going to end up affixing this to my dress, but for now I'm going to show you how to finish it clean without having a whole mess back here. Now, because we have two layers, the top and the bottom, and that stabilizer in there, I'm going to just try and tack my flower onto the top two pieces. So this outside and that stabilizer in there. I'm going to find the center just by folding it in half, slipping in a pin. And remember, my tie was stained and I want to cover this up. So I'm going to place my flower in the center of my belt. With my needle and thread, I'm going to just catch the top two pieces. And you can check back and make sure that thread didn't go through. Just look at the back side every time you pull the thread in. So I'm going to make an X. You can see the silver of my needle right there. So that means if I pull it through, a thread's going to show up. I'm going to pull it out so that doesn't happen. Just want to make it look nice and sharp. After you have a couple of tacks in the flower, and if you want to finish it with a button, just go ahead and set your button in there. I'm going to stitch my button down a couple of times. The last time, I'm going to let it go all the way through so that I can tie a knot back there. So that means the only thing that you'll see on the very back of this is the knot. So I have everything all tacked down on the front, and I'm just going to tie it off with an overhand knot. I'm wearing my finished top from last week, and now I have my finished sash from this week, and just gonna put it on and just tying it behind my back into a bow. And there is one version of my new look. I haven't tacked this flower down because I do want this all attached to the bodice. I'm just going to follow the top stitch line that I have around here, or you can follow your presser foot inside guide, and then I'm going to tack my flower down so that it'll lay flat, even after you wash it. Once you wash this, the flower might change a little bit too. And now for the finishing touches. I've folded my flower over the button and pinned it down, and I've pinned the belt onto the bodice exactly where I want it to stay. I have my sewing presser foot guide lined up with the top stitching or with the edge of the belt, and I stitch it all the way around. Now I have the flower tacked down onto the bodice and my belt attached to the bodice. So I hope you guys will come back and see how it all comes together with the skirt or with the skirt of your dress for next week. So Wednesday, work with what you got class. Thanks for being here.